Well, thank you for coming. It's always a joy to talk about my book or any book that I've written, because you spend so long sort of locked up in a room, not allowed to come out until it's finished, and then once it's ready, you can just go out into the world and share it. And this has been, of all the books I've written, this is the book that I've really loved the most, because I've made so many interesting friends among the characters in the book. This book's, I suppose you could, it's a group biography, it's a collective biography of 200 women who were involved in the suffragette campaign. Now, I'm going back to an old subject of mine. I'd always written about the suffragettes in terms of their militancy and the modernity of the campaign, how brilliant they were at marketing, the best political merchandisers in the business, really. They invented it. I don't know that anybody's actually ever surpassed them. But then I became very interested in who they were. And this took me into all different kinds of places all around the country, to Derbyshire, to Cornwall, to Shetland, to all kinds of archives and local stories to put this kind of chorus together. I've always conceptualised the story as very dramatic. It's about spectacle. It's about soliloquies. There's a lot of theatre references in my book, because I think they understood the value of performance in front of a mass audience to make political change. And I think we need to perhaps revisit some of their ideas now to make sure we get the political changes that we want. So it's a place, it's a story about lots of stars who are constant stars. There are lots of new actors walking onto stage in their campaign. There's a chorus, and there's lots of walk-on parts, and women having one moment in the story, and then we don't hear from them again, and women who have stories and involvement with the campaign all the way through. So I haven't discounted anybody, as long as they're interesting to me, even if they're just one militant moment or one moment, I want to put them into the book to give everybody a chance to be heard. So I'd like to share some of the ideas of my book with you this evening. Now let's see if I've got my right. Oh, great, thank goodness. Okay, well, of course, the Pankhursts are a really important part of my book, but I didn't want it just to be about them. But you can't talk about the suffragettes without talking about the Pankhursts, because they started the ball rolling. And remember that they joined a campaign that's been running for 40 years at least. And Mrs. Pankhurst had been involved in the moderate campaign before her husband died. And the position of Mrs. Pankhurst was that really, we've done 40 years of talking about this thing, talking about this need, how urgent it is, but we're still no further forward. And so she, in her front parlour, she started a new organisation with her daughters and some local independent Labour Party members, got them all together, and they founded the Women's Social and Political Union. And the slogan is "Deeds, not words." And her personality and her charisma and the skills and talents and charisma of her daughters gave this campaign a tremendous magnetic appeal. A lot of young women, when they met them, they saw them in the street, they heard their voices, would join a campaign, which was very unpopular, it was very difficult, it was very dangerous to be a suffragette, no matter what you were doing along that spectrum of militancy and activism. And they were so sort of appealing and honest and direct and strong. They attracted this very diverse group of women from all over the country, from all different backgrounds, with all different life experiences to share and to contribute to the campaign. So it's an extremely exciting and important sort of struggle of all kinds of women. And that was something I was really interested to find out more about. So on the far left we have Sylvia. I'm sure you'll all know these characters. Sylvia, who is a clever artist and designer, and she kind of brands the campaign. She invents the look, and she gives them the look, the branding, and she is a brilliant designer of events. And of course, she's a very devoted activist in the East End of London and a very serious militant. Her sister Christabel has got a first-class degree in law, but because she's a woman, she can't be a lawyer. But she diverts and channels her enormous talent into the strategy and the forward-thinking and the planning, and the propaganda aspect of the campaign. She's a brilliant speaker, she's charismatic, and when she speaks, she's so magnetic that lots of the young women in the audience are going to take part, they're going to engage with the campaign on so many different levels. Mrs. Pankhurst, of course, tiny woman. Her shoe size was 2, which is ridiculously small, but there you go. And she's got this huge personality bursting out of this tiny frame. And she's a very appealing character with a very strong focus. And of course, Annie Kenney, who was a young woman who joined the campaign. Her mother had died, and there's this vast hole in her life. She comes from a big family. I think she came from about 9 or 10 children. And she is mourning, very much in mourning for her mother. And her friend takes her to a meeting, and the rest is history. She becomes very close to the Pankhurst family. She's more or less adopted by them. She joins them, and she's a very important character for them. She's a poster girl, and she can reach into working class communities and get working class women to join. There's always been this idea that working class women had very little role in the campaign, that they were rejected by the Pankhursts, that it was a middle class sort of hobby that the Pankhursts were playing around with, and the moderates too. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Pankhursts were devoted to the idea of getting votes for working women, and Annie Kenney was very important in opening up the campaign to a very diverse group. And there are other working class women who joined because of Annie, and they very often asked her to dress up in her mill clothes, her clogs and shawl, and the skirts and the other garments she wore when she was working in the cotton mill. And they would ask her to perhaps lead a procession through a working class community. And the idea is anybody who saw her would think, oh, she's in it, that's working class women are not barred from this organisation. There's something in it for us. And she was able to get working class women all over the country, not just in the north of England. She was very busy down in the west of England for about 4 years, organising down there, and her reach into Wales as well. So she's really, really critical. And she's very senior by the end of the campaign. She's one of the deputy leaders when everybody is on the run or in exile. So Annie Kenney is really powerful, brilliant woman. The end papers of my book have got lots of these kind of images. I didn't want to talk about the images, so I just thought, let's put them as end papers. So this is the context in which the suffragettes were actually operating, this hostile environment. And this, obvious where we're going here. Mummy's a suffragette, screaming baby out of control. The home is being neglected, children being neglected because mummy wants the vote. So that's the level we're operating on most of the time. And of course, domestic chaos and anarchy when women want the vote. This poor chap is asking the question, is your wife a suffragette? The implication is because mine is, because I've got to do this washing, get involved in this mangling. So hundreds of different kinds of designs, images on this theme and others were circulating in Edwardian England at this time. It's the golden age of the postcard. The postcard was the kind of the tweet or the text of its day. People arranged meetings in the morning to meet up with people in the afternoon. London's got 12 deliveries of post. It's perfectly possible to send off a postcard. Those were the days. And sometimes we didn't get any post at all. And I live in central London. So postcards are really important. And there was such an appetite for these hostile, schoolboy, childish, sometimes unpleasant images that lots of artists, lots of reputable artists, and lots of people who just fancy themselves as amateur artists were producing hundreds of different designs. Postcard manufacturers were making them because there was such a huge demand for them. And this is just two of probably about 1,000 different designs, I would think, flooding the letterboxes, filling up the letterboxes and pillar boxes of Edwardian London and England. This is the first postcard I ever bought, Suffragettes Who've Never Been Kissed, harping on the same old theme that it's only the unattractive older women who are sexually frustrated who want to be part of this campaign. They're all, look very cross, very angry, thin necks, badly dressed, strange hairstyles, looking slightly moth-eaten. And this was designed to frighten young women and others from taking an interest in these suffragettes. It's corny, it's crass, it's schoolboy, but it's kind of pretty much hitting the note for lots of the opposition. Of course, the market was flooded with these kind of images. Women out of control, shrieking, attacking police with their umbrellas. Women looking more like men in a dress. Quite a lot of facial hair was one of the usual images. And of course, when people saw what the suffragettes were like on marches through London and processions, there was a huge disparity. And these were just a nonsense, really, but they were still popular, and people were sending them right up until the end of 1914, and by which time the First World War had broken out. So this is the climate they're operating in. Then, of course, this is the apocalyptic vision of what will happen when women get the vote. This is a dreadful thing, isn't it? I mean, look at this. Husbands are going to have to look after their children and get involved in wash day. Look at the horror of that. He's very red in the face. There's a baby screaming its head off, and it's all terrible. Because the world has been turned upside down. You know, it's a topsy-turvy world. Look, because mother, his wife, is just sitting around, smoking, playing cards with her friends, having a great time, while poor our husband has to do the chores, look after the child. And this was an image, there was a whole series of these produced to frighten people into thinking, this is what's going to happen when women vote. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, by the way. Anyway, here, when women vote, women are going to start to ask their fiancés, their young men, to marry them. They're the ones who are going to go to their mothers and ask for their future husband's hands. So again, this is tremendous role reversal, which is felt to be only to the detriment of civilised society. Here's Annie in her poster girl mode, and her clothes from her mill working days. Remember, she'd been a half-timer. She'd gone to it when she was 8, and she became a full-timer when she was 13. So she had masses of credibility when it came to recruiting working women. She could say to them, look, I know how it is, because I'm a working woman, and that was my life until I joined this campaign. And if you support us, you know, we can change women's lives for good. I was interested to know about the age range of women involved in this campaign. And it could really be teenagers, really quite young girls were getting involved in this campaign. Sometimes with the permission of their parents, and sometimes not. And of course that could cause problems, as you'd expect. They could be 16 and 17 years old. And they could be women who were in their 70s, which at that time was really old. And you think a lot of women considered to be old in their 40s and 50s. Women going on marches and processions like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Elizabeth Walsingham Elmy, these women who were in their 70s, going on events, going to Parliament with Mrs. Pankhurst and her supporters. You know, these were dangerous moments, these were difficult choices. But these women from the 19th century were part very much of the suffragette campaign. This lady, this young girl, worked in her father's chemist shop in Westminster. She was born Jessie Spinks, but she was known as Vera Wentworth. She did that to kind of spare her father's feelings. He wasn't out, you know, never darken my door again if you get involved with that lot. She just wanted to spare his business, actually. And so she called herself Vera Wentworth. Quite a lot of suffragettes worked under aliases, sometimes to avoid the police and to try and kind of reduce the severity of their criminal record, because if they had different names, they could be just charged as the first offence, whereas if you've got using the same name all the time, your sentence is going to be increased with every conviction. So sometimes it's to try and outwit the police and have shorter prison sentences. Other times it's going to be sparing their families' feelings. And you know, family was really important, because if you wanted to be a suffragette, you really had to have the support of your parents, especially your father, because of course fathers ruled the roost. And it was so important to have your family behind you. And there were thousands involved in the suffragette campaign. People thought it was just a small movement and they were just scattered, and mostly London and in the southeast. It wasn't, it was everywhere. You could engage with it on so many different levels. And to be a suffragette didn't just mean going on hunger strike and being force-fed and burning down churches and these really extreme moments of suffering and criminality. It could be to do with selling the newspaper on the street, holding a placard, or going to an event, or handing out leaflets, or helping out at local branches with sort of volunteering, or making donations. And there were thousands of women on subscription lists that are published in the newspapers every week. They can build up a database of thousands of women in England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland who were part of this campaign. This young lady joined when she was 18. She becomes an organiser, and she's a militant, and she goes to prison several times. But she was really quite young at the beginning of her militant career. She has a kind of a suffragette career break. She goes off to St Andrews, studies English for 2 years, comes back and throws herself back into the campaign. So it was a question of what you could do, you did. Sometimes you had to withdraw for various reasons, but then women were going back into it when circumstances permitted. Of course, some women were at it right from the beginning all the way through. Now, Annie was having such a great time with the WSPU that she encouraged 2 of her sisters to get involved, and one of her brothers, actually. Although men couldn't join the WSPU, they were really important as helpers in different ways. And this is Jessie Kenny sitting in front of the map, and she ran the office. She was the personal assistant of Mrs. Pethick Lawrence. And I like this image because it's the map that shows the extent, how nationwide the WSPU were. This photograph is taken in 1910, by which time there were branches, there were committee rooms, and there were shops selling Votes Women literature and purple, white and green merchandise, and Votes Women merchandise too. So they're very imaginative and creative, and they made a lot of money for the campaign, because campaigns cost a lot of money, so you're always having to think of new ideas of raising money to get your message out there. I love this photograph because it just looks so professional. It's a real hub, isn't it? It's a real hub of political activism, and full of women going about their business and making this important thing work. Well, the WSPU, Mrs. Pethick Lawrence actually invented the colour scheme purple, white and green. And it was launched at Women's Sunday in 1908 in Hyde Park. And it was a great success. But of course, not everybody dared wear the colour scheme. Some women were too afraid to wear badges. They just bought a badge and carried it around in their pockets. Because there was a lot of resistance to the suffragettes, a huge amount of resistance. And right from the earliest days, even before they were attacking windows and getting involved in what seemed like obvious, overt criminal activity, people were so appalled by them and disgusted by them and affronted by them that some people couldn't even wear a badge. But for those who did, there was a vast array of merchandise. There were board games, there was jewellery. This is Suffragette tea set that was available in 1909. There's rosettes, there's postcards, there's this is Mrs. Lamartine Yates, who ran the Wimbledon branch, and her little boy Paul. Christmas cards were always in purple, white and green. That one there is from 1910. And, you know, this was some of the earliest merchandise. As the campaign pushed its message out there, as its reach extended, then businesses and suffragette entrepreneurs are starting to make purple, white and green stuff. In fact, 2 young women who were the daughters of the man who owned the Lillian Skinner shoe manufacturing business, Kate and Louis Lilly, they persuaded their father to do a range of suffragette shoes and slippers. So that was nice to have that kind of influence. And if you were really well off, you could have a suffragette car painted and upholstered in the colours of the movement, but that was that's high-end marketing. The big department stores around the country would buy in purple, white and green blouses and skirts and dresses and shoes and bags and accessories, a whole range of stuff for their customers. And the price points varied too. If you were really well off, you could have jewellery from Mappin & Webb, but if you couldn't afford that much, there were much cheaper versions of glass bead necklaces and badges and brooches. So there was something there for everybody at all different price points. And it was colourful. But again, it attracted a great deal of hostility from members of the public. And it's hard to imagine how men and women too could take offence. There are quite a lot of examples of suffragettes having meetings, say on Wimbledon Common or street corner meeting, and being attacked by other women who were so affronted by what they were saying, by their messages, by their behaviour. And putting yourself up for that kind of scrutiny and that kind of display often meant you were pelted with kind of horse manure or dead cats and dogs in the East End of London. Sylvia Pankhurst had to deal with dead cats and dogs being thrown at her, or rotting fruit and vegetables. So you had to be really tough, you had to be really thick-skinned, and you had to be prepared to dodge cabbages, lumps of coal, all kind of stuff being chucked at you. This, of course, is one of the most famous images of the suffragette story in Westminster. This is Black Friday. And it's a powerful image because there's so much material that comes out of this particular day. Caxton Hall was full of suffragettes waiting for Asquith to come to some conclusion about the Conciliation Bill. They get a message that it's been dropped, it's been fudged, it's been abandoned. And as usual, he is wriggling out of promises he made or commitments he pretended to make. So they grew off in groups of a dozen, about 300 altogether in Parliament Square. They don't get anywhere near Parliament, really, because there's a huge police presence. It's there already, they're expecting them. The suffragettes were never very secretive about what they were up to. They would announce, this is what we shall do. So there's loads of uniformed constables that we can see here, lots of mounted policemen there to intimidate women, to kind of push them against the railings. The aim of the policing of this particular event was to stop them coming back and doing it again. And the presence in the crowd of large numbers of policemen from the East End of London who had been used to dealing with kind of violent drunks. They'd been drafted in to mingle in the crowd in plain clothes, just regular clothes, wearing badges which said Men's League for Women's Suffrage. So they were in disguise. They were there pretending to be supporters, and they were the opposite. And they were agents provocateurs. And a lot of those men are responsible for a lot of, and the uniformed policemen too, actually, for the violence that women endured on that day. It was a dark day. It was called Black Friday quite soon afterwards because it was such a horrible, shocking, bewildering event. So there were 150 carefully documented cases of physical and sexual violence. Women were sexually assaulted by uniformed policemen who bundled them into side streets and encouraged these plainclothes policemen to do what they wanted. And you know, the stories, the testimony is shocking, it's awful. Some of them were brave enough to write about it, submit their experiences to the committee who investigated the day, and some of them are really brave enough to describe the sexual violence that they had experienced. Mrs. Saul Solomon was a very interesting woman. Was in bed for a month. She was so badly bruised and beaten up and sexually molested on that day that she couldn't leave her house for a month. But she's prepared to put her name to that kind of evidence, which took a great deal of courage. On this day, women are going to be kicked to the ground, kicked in the stomach, their hair is pulled, their clothes are torn off, they're crushed against railings. It's kind of hand-to-hand fighting. And Caxton Hall becomes like a field hospital, which quickly fills up with suffragette supporting nurses and doctors who go there to do basic first aid. And it really was like a field hospital. Charles Mansell Moulin was a surgeon whose wife was a very important activist called Ruth Mansell Moulin, talks about and submitted his evidence to the report about Black Friday. So it's a horrible day, and the following, this is on a Friday, the following 2 days later on Sunday, and 3 days of the following week, women go back to Parliament Square, they go to Downing Street, they try to get into Downing Street to express their outrage at the actions, the policies, the instructions of the Home Secretary, of course, is Winston Churchill. And it's such a dangerous time. Mrs. Pankhurst's own sister Mary Clark was badly hurt. And actually she died on Christmas Day, and it's felt her stroke was attributable to the events of Black Friday and her prison sentence and the force feeding that she endured afterwards. So Black Friday is one day, but there's 3 or 4 days that follow, which are equally vicious and equally dangerous. Mrs. Pankhurst decides that it's too dangerous to go to Parliament in those circumstances. She said, we're exposed to police molestation, which is a quaint way of putting it, for too long. We're going to carry on, but we're not going to do that kind of protest anymore. We're going to go underground. We're going to wage guerrilla war against this government and make the government give us the vote. And that's the start of suffragette tactics changing, diversifying, and spreading throughout the country like wildfire. They were going to be taking part in militancy, which would get them arrested, but they wanted to be arrested straight away. You see, this kind of protest meant they were kind of being kettled, a bit like protesters are still when there's these kind of numbers involved. And that was when there's too much time, when the police have got too much time to kind of manhandle them and whatever. And so future militancy is going to be something which is very obvious. They smash a window and they present themselves to be arrested straight away. Off to the police station, job done. So it's a significant moment. This is definitely a tipping point. People sometimes say to me, who's your favourite suffragette? And, you know, it's really hard because there's 200 in the book, and they're all fabulous. So it's hard for me to pick out one because they're all special. And this is Edith Rigby. And Edith Rigby was from Preston. And she's such a gorgeous woman. She's so unconventional, and you just had to look at Edith to know that she was different to everybody else, because she was very earnest, she's very kind of uncompromising. She didn't wear regular clothes, she made her own clothes, which are great big baggy dresses. She's certainly one of the first hippies in this country. She made her own jewellery, great chunky beads, that was not fashionable at all, but Edith was kind of pretty unique. She wore sandals all year round, and she chain smoked in public, so, you know, she's quite different to anybody else. Her husband was a doctor, and her father and two brothers were doctors. And she lived in a part of Preston where, like lots of towns in the UK, there's a smart part, but close by there are poor communities. And she lived on this sort of the cusp, such a cuspal sort of arrangement. And she was determined to get votes for working class women. She recruited lots of local women, brought them to London, got them involved in all kinds of demonstrations. She went to prison about 6 times, in fact. And she organised local protests in Preston too. And towards the end of the campaign, she gets really involved in militancy. And she burns the summer house down of a man called Sir William Lever, who was an MP, because of his attitude to women's suffrage. It was empty, of course. All the buildings they ever attacked were empty. And she was sent to prison for that. She went on hunger strike. She was released. And in 1913, as you know, the government introduced this act that became known as the Cat and Mouse Act. And it was such a brilliant failure, actually, for the government, because they thought that they would let the suffragettes starve, so they're really weak. They would release them on a special licence. They would release them to a particular address. And they really thought the suffragettes were just going to sit it out, put on some weight, and wait to be rearrested and taken back into prison. So the sentences are going to be worked. You know, you have to work your sentence off, and it's going to take a long time to get through the 6 months. The government thought they're going to give up. They're going to get so demoralised. It's going to be great. You know, we're going to sort this problem out with the Cat and Mouse Act. Of course that didn't work, because they were released. Hooray. They went to these various addresses and they recovered. But very few of them ever rearrested, because they were very good at escaping from under the eyes of the police. There was a police cordon, there was 24-hour surveillance of the houses where they were being kept, which were a bit like nursing homes in part. And they were so good at getting body doubles to come in and visit them, swapping clothes and just walking past the police and leaving their friend behind. They were very good, some of the smaller ones certainly, at escaping in laundry baskets. So they were very good at actually making great escapes from under the nose of the police. So they would vanish, they'd go into hiding, they'd meet up with other suffragettes, sympathisers all over the country, and they'd go around doing more militancy. And that's what Edith did. She was released after the Sir William Lever attack, and she tried to burn down the Liverpool Cotton Exchange, and she was rearrested for that. So she's in and out of prison a lot. And I want to share just a little bit of a letter, because Edith was so lucky. She had a really lovely husband called Charlie, and Charlie just backed her all the way. I don't think I had much choice, actually, which was great. But anyway, in the latter part of 1913, the early part of 1914, she's on the run in Ireland. He hasn't got a clue where she is. She's actually hiding in Galway. And one of Edith's school friends wrote a sympathetic letter to Charlie. And I just love this response. Well, I might actually just choke up a bit because it's so great. He wrote back to this friend of hers, "It's a difficult business, but for me there's only one course, and that's to back Edith. I know her perfect sincerity and love of justice. She feels it to be the only course her conscience allows her to follow. She's willing to suffer blows, loss of friends, and starvation. She's almost a shadow, scarcely able to stand, with the smile of an angel and the courage of a lion. I do not have the moral courage to do what she has done. I doubt I could do it for any cause. It makes me feel so ashamed, and I feel so unworthy of her." And isn't that great? I mean, honestly, I love Charlie because he was the perfect husband, and he just backed whatever she did. He just followed her. I mean, for a lot of the time, he had no idea where she was. And he's a doctor, so he must have been concerned about her health, as we can see in that short extract. But Edith was just completely unswerving, persistent and stubborn. And she finally gets back into the country just about the time of the outbreak of the First World War, and gets involved in war work. I love this photograph because it looks so modern. It was taken by special branch surveillance teams. This was a camera set up in the exercise yard at Holloway Prison. The young woman involved was called Grace Markon. Her father was a clergyman, and she was a gymnastics teacher and a masseuse in London. Her father allowed her and her sisters quite a bit of freedom, actually, which was nice. And she actually called herself by another name. She called herself Frida Thomas, because she didn't want to embarrass him, because Markon is such a distinctive name, and he was very well known in his kind of Norfolk community. So Grace gets really involved in lots of militancy, and she's very active from about 1911 to 1914. So she's one of a young cohort. Let me just give you an idea about the diversity of women who do this kind of work. You could be a theatre performer. Kitty Marion was a comedian who did lots of militancy. In fact, she was force-fed 232 times in 1 year alone. You could be a male impersonator. You could be a colleague of Esther Tilley, like Vera Home, and be a suffragette. You could be one of many nurses. Lots of school teachers were suffragettes. So some women doctors, students, servants, factory workers, shop girls, all kinds of women were involved in this campaign. And here we've got Grace Markon, who is a gymnastics teacher and a masseuse. Well, it wasn't all gloom and doom and pain and torture and suffering, although that was quite a big part of it in prison. This is a suffragette sleepover. And I love this photograph because it was taken on the night of the census in 1911. And they said, well, if we don't have the vote, why should we be counted in the population? So we're not going to do it. The government threatened to prosecute them with a big fine in prison, but at least 4,000 women avoided the census. And they had a great time. Some of them went roller skating all night. Some of them went to smoking parties, just sat and smoked all night. Shocking to us, but fun to them. There were the Actresses Franchise League, who were associated with the WSPU. They put on performances and sing-songs and soliloquies, and all kinds of suffrage plays were being performed. Some of them hired caravans, horse-drawn caravans, and went and spent the night on Wimbledon Common, or other commons all over the country. So it was great fun, and they made a really fun night of it, and kind of defeated the census takers, which was marvellous. I was very privileged to meet this lady here. On the right, she's known as Mrs. Lydd. She was 100 years old, and she was a suffragette. And this is how she looked when she was a suffragette, when she was about 20. She was from Bristol, she was from Clifton. And she was so amazing, this woman. I feel, honestly, it's one of the most thrilling moments of my life was to just sit down and spend a day with her, because actually, at 100, she was still really a suffragette. She still had this incredible sparkle and charisma and fight, and there was a lot of fight in her, even at age 100. She was a political activist for the rest of her life. Once the vote came, she got married in the First World War, and she'd been involved in all kinds of animal rights campaigns, animal welfare, anti-vivisection. And the last big campaign she worked on was the ordination of women priests, which she actually lived to see come to fruition, so that was great. She's a lifelong vegetarian. When I met her, I said, "Oh, Mrs. Lydia, let's go and have some lunch." She said, "Oh, yes, but it'll have to be vegetarian, dear. I've been a vegetarian since 1897. This was 1897. Very well. But she was gorgeous, and 3 of her sisters were involved, and her mother was involved. She sometimes got... It must have been great if you were in a suffragette family, and your father, your dad didn't mind, your husband didn't mind, and you and your daughters could get involved in it, and the boys could come too for protection, because you needed protection, because it could be quite dangerous. And I think it must have just been great for Victoria Simmons and her sister Winnie and the others to come up and get involved without any comeback, without any pushback, as we would say now, from their male relatives. Because, of course, you know, a lot of fathers disowned their daughters. A lot of marriages suffered, engagements were broken, and young women lost their jobs. And it was a really tough decision. It was coming out. It was a really coming out moment. And for those who were able to do it, it was a thrilling and difficult and dangerous time. It was, you know, they were at the height of their powers, these women at this time, and it must have been great to be part of it. Finally, this photograph was taken in 1967, and it's a group of suffragists and suffragettes who have been brought together by the Observer magazine to be part of a supplement. An article celebrating 50th anniversary of women getting the vote. And they're standing in front of the 3 banners, the Women's Freedom League, NUWSS, and the banner on the far right, the WSPU. That's on display at the Museum of London. I think it's the most beautiful object in the museum. It is absolutely stunning. It's a bit like a friendship quilt. It's got 80 signatures that have been embroidered. And it's a snapshot in time, so please go and see it. If you haven't seen it, go and study it and go and look at the names and follow them up, because there's some fantastic names on that banner. It represents women who've been to prison and been on hunger strike and been force-fed in the latter part of 1909 to the spring of 1910. It was made, it was constructed, it was designed by Annie Macbeth at from the Glasgow School of Art in the embroidery department, and it's just stunning. And it's got some really interesting names. It's got Constance Lytton's autograph and her alter ego, Jane Wharton, when she goes in disguise as a working class woman to Liverpool. And she's there. Emily Whiting Davison's there. Alice Paul, an American woman. Lucy Burns, another American student who met here in London and became American suffragettes. They went right through the kind of career spectrum. They went back to America and took some militancy with them. And there's some really very famous names on that banner, but there's some really interesting names of women I had to really go and look for to find out a bit more about the context of their involvement. And again, it's all about diversity, age, class, occupation and experience. So please go and see that banner. But I just want to point out some of my favourites here. This lady here is Mrs. O'Brien, Gwen O'Brien, and she's one of Mrs. Pankhurst's bodyguard. And I think we can see why. And this image here is really kind of quite sensible and formal, and that's probably what made it into the Observer. Things have loosened up a bit here, haven't they? We're relaxing a bit here. And this is a little cigarillo come out, lit up. And the lady to the top right, dark glasses have gone on, and a cigarette's lit up, and her gloves are off. And I think she needs a gin, actually. I think she's. And I know the man who took this photograph in 1967, and he was a very clever man. But I think he must have had a hell of an afternoon, actually, coping with these 30 powerful women with very powerful personalities. She actually, the lady with the dark glasses, was called Lady Paddy Winstead, and she was a doctor, at the Royal Free. And when she wasn't doing her doctoring, she had a career as a suffragette. She was moonlighting as a suffragette who chained herself to the railings and that kind of thing. She actually went off during the 1920s to set up all the midwifery and gynae services in Malaya. So she was interesting. And in her obituaries, Lady Penny Winstead is known as she's famous for her parties. So this great personality kind of leaps off the pages of all the obituaries. She must have been a real character, I think we say. Now this young woman here, right in front of her, that's Jessie Kenny, who we saw before in front of the map. And Jessie was marvellous. She trained to be a ship's radio, what's the word? A radio operator. And she did the training, and she was qualified, but she couldn't actually be a radio operator because women weren't allowed to. So she worked on. She loved going. She loved ocean. She loved cruises. So she stayed on ship, but she was a stewardess, even though she was a fully qualified radio operator. And when she got sick of cruising, she became a school secretary. And I wonder if that school in Streatham knew what her background was and what she'd done. It would have been so interesting if she ever talked about it. I don't know. This woman here is called Una de Vala, the Red Hat. And Una de Vala was from a big family of suffragette boys and girls. And she married she's called Una Dugdale, and she married Victor de Val. So two suffragette families were put together. And they were a remarkable group of people. And she got married in 1912, and she said, well, I'm not going to say I obey when I get married. I'm not going to do that. And she announced that to the press. The Archbishop of Canterbury said, well, if you don't say that, you won't be married. And I don't know. So she carried on, and that was that. So that's what they were like. They weren't afraid to take on the establishment at all. Standing next to Lady Paddy is Grace Rowe. Grace Rowe always looked like that. When she was about 20, she looked like that, and she looked like she had the same rather worried look all her life. And she's wearing her colours, and she's got a Hunger Strike medal. And she was really senior when Mrs. Pankhurst is in and out of prison, Annie Kenny's in and out of prison, Christabel is in exile in Paris. She's running the show, secretly. They couldn't be that open about their rank, really, in the hierarchy, because the police were rounding them up and arresting them all the time. So Grace Rowe is very, very important indeed. And the last lady I want to draw attention to is this one here, Lillian Lenton, who was known as the Tiny Pimpernel. And she's called the Tiny Pimpernel because she was the best one at escaping from under the noses of the police. She was quite small. She looked really like a small child. She was about 20, but she was tiny. And she could be smuggled out in a laundry basket. So she was often able to outwit the police. And she's definitely a pyromaniac because she just loved burning down buildings. She just loved it. And when she was arrested and sentenced at Bow Street, she said, well, it's all very well, when I get out again, I'm going to burn down 2 buildings a week. So there. So she's marvellous, Lillian Lenton. And she lived till about 1975, so she was really quite old. And she was pretty active and absolutely still a suffragette. She helped raise the money for a very nice bit of sculpture which is between Caxton Hall. There's a tiny little walkway, it's called Christchurch Gardens. There's no graves there, but it's just called Christchurch Gardens. And there's something called the Suffragette Flame. It's a bronze sculpture, and it was put up by the Suffragette Fellowship, of which she was a leading member. And she helped raise the money for this lovely bronze, so 1970s, with an inscription about the Suffragette Fellowship and militancy and all that kind of thing. So if you haven't been to see that, it's really worth it. And it's just opposite, outside in front of Caxton Hall, between Caxton Street and Victoria Street. So go and see that. But Lillian Lenton, who was kind of in her 80s at that point, spent a lot of her time and energies raising money for that. And there's a lovely photograph of her at the unveiling, which is great. So that's all I want to say about my images and my book. And if any of you have got any questions, I'll be very happy to try and answer them. Thank you.